Pay attention to the Middle Eastern man, raising his foot to stomp on books outside this London church. His name is Arif, a Muslim activist leading protests. Then his legs suddenly freeze mid-motion, collapsing helplessly as church members rush to help him.
My name is Arif. I'm 28 years old, and on August 29th, 2023, I experienced something that completely shattered everything I believed about God. I was a Muslim activist in London, and I had just organized my biggest protest yet against a local church. Then the impossible happened. I grew up in a devout Muslim household in Birmingham, where my father was an imam at our local mosque, and my mother taught Quran classes to young children. From the moment I could speak, I was taught that Islam was the only true path to God, and that all other religions, especially Christianity, were corruptions of divine truth. My earliest memories are filled with the melodic calls to prayer echoing through our neighborhood, the feeling of cool marble beneath my knees during countless hours of worship, and the pride I felt knowing I was part of something pure and unchanging. By the time I reached my teenage years, that pride had begun to transform into something darker. I started noticing Christian churches scattered throughout Birmingham, their bells ringing on Sunday mornings as our community gathered for Jummah prayers. Something about their presence irritated me deeply. Why were these symbols of what I believed to be false religion allowed to exist so prominently in our city? My father would often speak about how Christianity had twisted the original message that God had sent through Jesus, turning him from a prophet into something blasphemous. The more I heard these teachings, the more I felt a burning need to defend my faith against what I saw as Christian lies. When I turned 18, I enrolled at Birmingham University to study political science, but my real education was happening outside the classroom. I discovered online forums where young Muslims from across Europe gathered to discuss what we called the Christian invasion of our communities. We shared stories about missionaries attempting to convert Muslims, about Christian charities that we believed had ulterior motives, and about the way Western governments seemed to favor Christian values over Islamic ones. These conversations fed something hungry inside me, something that craved purpose and righteous anger. I remember the exact moment my activism began. I was walking past St. Chad's Cathedral one December evening when I saw families streaming out of what appeared to be a Christmas service. Children were laughing, parents were smiling, and everyone seemed so content, so sure of themselves. The sight filled me with rage. How dare they celebrate what I knew to be a false holiday based on lies about God's nature? That night, I went home and created my first social media account dedicated to exposing what I called Christian deception. My online presence grew quickly. I started with simple posts questioning Christian doctrine, but my content became increasingly aggressive as I gained followers. I shared videos debunking the Trinity, posted articles about historical crusades, and created memes mocking Christian beliefs. The positive response from other young Muslims fed my ego and convinced me that I was doing God's work. Within 6 months, I had thousands of followers who looked to me for guidance on how to resist Christian influence. The transition from online activism to street protests happened gradually. It started with organizing prayer gatherings outside prominent churches during their major celebrations. We would time our prayers to coincide with their services, making sure our voices carried into their buildings during their worship. I told my followers that we were simply exercising our religious freedom, but I knew the truth. We were there to intimidate, to remind Christians that they were not welcome to spread their lies in our neighborhoods without opposition. Our protests escalated over the next 2 years. We began carrying signs with verses from the Quran that contradicted Christian teachings. We handed out pamphlets explaining why Christianity was a corruption of God's true message. Some of our group members started shouting during Christian street evangelism events, drowning out their speakers with calls of Allahu Akbar. Each successful disruption made me feel more powerful, more convinced that I was fighting a holy war against deception. Ask yourself this question: Have you ever felt so certain about something that you were willing to hurt others to defend it? That was exactly where I found myself by my 25th birthday. My hatred for Christianity had consumed every aspect of my life. I had dropped out of university to focus full-time on what I called my ministry. I had lost friends who thought I was becoming too extreme, and even my parents had started expressing concern about my activities, but I believed their worry was simply proof that I was the only one brave enough to stand up for truth. The idea to desecrate Bibles came to me during Ramadan in 2023. I was fasting and spending extra hours in prayer and meditation, asking Allah to show me how I could serve Him more effectively. During one particularly intense prayer session, I became convinced that God was calling me to take more drastic action. Online protests and street demonstrations were not enough. I needed to do something that would send an unmistakable message to every Christian in London that their book, their so-called Holy Scripture, was nothing more than corrupted paper. I spent weeks researching the most effective way to make this statement. I visited multiple bookstores, purchasing different versions of the Bible while telling cashiers I was doing comparative religious research. Each time I held one of those books in my hands, I felt physically sick. The weight of what I believed to be pure blasphemy was almost unbearable. I would take them home and store them in my garage, unable to even look at them without feeling angry. The planning phase consumed me completely. I researched which churches had the largest Sunday congregations, which locations would provide the most visibility for our demonstration, and which local news outlets might cover our protest. I recruited 12 of my most dedicated followers, young men who shared my conviction that Christianity was a poison spreading through our community. We spent hours discussing every detail, from the timing of our arrival to the specific words we would shout as I destroyed their false scriptures. By August 2023, everything was ready. I had purchased 27 Bibles of various translations and sizes. I had created custom signs declaring the supremacy of Islamic truth. I had even practiced the specific way I would stomp on each book to ensure maximum visual impact. The date was set for August 29th, a Sunday when St. Mary's Church would be holding their largest service of the month. I was absolutely certain that this would be my greatest victory for Allah, the moment when London's Christian community would finally understand that their lies would not go unchallenged. I had no idea that I was about to discover just how wrong a person could be about God. The morning of August 29th, 2023, started like any other day of planned protest. I woke up before dawn for Fajr prayers, feeling more determined and righteous than I had ever felt in my entire life. As I knelt on my prayer rug facing Mecca, I asked Allah to bless my mission and to give me strength to carry out what I believed was His will. The weight of my purpose felt heavy on my shoulders, but it was a burden I carried with pride. I was convinced that this day would mark a turning point in the fight against Christian deception in London. I had instructed my followers to meet me at a coffee shop 3 blocks away from St. Mary's Church at 8:30 in the morning. The church service was scheduled to begin at 10, which would give us enough time to position ourselves strategically and prepare our materials. I loaded the 27 Bibles into 2 large duffel bags, along with our protest signs and a portable megaphone I had purchased specifically for this event. Each book felt like a weight of corruption in my hands, and I remember feeling physically relieved each time I zipped the bags closed, hiding their blasphemous contents from view. My 12 followers arrived punctually, each one dressed in simple clothes that would not draw unnecessary attention from police before we began our demonstration. These were young men I had personally recruited and trained over the past 2 years, Muslims who shared my conviction that Christianity was a cancer that needed to be confronted boldly. Some of them had traveled from Birmingham and Manchester specifically for this event, seeing it as a pilgrimage of sorts. We spent 20 minutes reviewing our plan one final time making sure everyone understood their role in what we expected to be our most impactful protest yet. The walk to St. Mary's Church felt like a march to battle. We carried our materials in ordinary bags and backpacks, trying to appear like any other group of young men walking through central London on a Sunday morning, but internally my heart was pounding with anticipation and religious fervor. I kept reciting verses from the Quran under my breath, verses that I believed justified what we were about to do. The closer we got to our destination, the more convinced I became that Allah Himself was guiding our steps. St. Mary's Church sits on a busy corner with a small courtyard area that separates the building from the main sidewalk. This courtyard was perfect for our purposes because it provided enough space for our demonstration while ensuring maximum visibility to both church members and passing pedestrians. We arrived at 9:15 and immediately began setting up our protest materials. I positioned myself directly in front of the main church entrance, while my followers spread out in a semicircle behind me with their signs reading, "Islam is truth and Christianity is corruption." The first church members began arriving around 9:45, mostly elderly couples dressed in their Sunday finest. I remember watching them approach and feeling a mixture of contempt and pity. These people had been so thoroughly deceived by their false religion that they actually believed they were coming to worship the true God. Some of them glanced nervously at our group as they passed, but most simply hurried past us toward the church doors. Their obvious discomfort gave me a sense of satisfaction. We were already disrupting their comfortable delusion. By 10 o'clock, families with children were streaming toward the church entrance. This was exactly what I had hoped for. I wanted children to witness what we were about to do because I believed they deserved to know the truth about their parents' false beliefs before it was too late. I pulled out my megaphone and began shouting verses from the Quran that contradicted core Christian doctrines, particularly passages that denied the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus Christ. My voice echoed off the surrounding buildings, ensuring that everyone within a 3-block radius could hear our message. The church members' reactions varied dramatically. Some quickened their pace and avoided eye contact, clearly wanting to escape our presence as quickly as possible. Others stopped to stare, their faces showing mixtures of confusion, fear, and anger. A few brave souls attempted to engage us in conversation, asking why we were there and whether we might consider moving our demonstration elsewhere. I responded to each inquiry with more Quranic verses and accusations about their corrupted faith. The more uncomfortable they became, the more powerful I felt. After about 15 minutes of vocal protest, I decided it was time to escalate to the main event. I opened the first duffel bag and pulled out a large leather-bound study Bible that I had specifically chosen for its expensive appearance. I wanted to destroy something that clearly represented a significant investment, something that would make the maximum psychological impact. The conversations around us stopped completely as people realized what I was holding. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, and several adults pulled out their phones to record what they correctly sensed was about to become a shocking incident. I held the Bible high above my head so that everyone could see it clearly, then announced through my megaphone that I was about to demonstrate the true worth of their corrupted scriptures. The courtyard fell silent except for the sound of traffic from the nearby street and the distant singing coming from inside the church building. Even my own followers seemed to hold their breath as they watched me prepare for what we had planned for weeks. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been so convinced of your own righteousness that you were completely blind to the possibility that you might be wrong? That was exactly my state of mind as I threw that first Bible down onto the concrete pavement with deliberate force. The sound of the book hitting the ground seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I raised my right foot high in the air, positioning it directly above the open pages, ready to bring it down with all the force I could muster. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph, the instant when I would demonstrate the powerlessness of the Christian God and the superiority of Islamic truth. I had rehearsed this exact motion dozens of times in my garage, practicing the angle and force that would create the most dramatic visual impact. My followers were recording everything on their phones, ready to share this victory across social media within minutes. The horrified faces of the Christian families provided the perfect backdrop for what I believed would become a legendary moment in the fight against religious deception. I was absolutely certain that nothing could stop me from completing this righteous act. I had never been more wrong about anything in my entire life. The moment my foot began its descent toward that open Bible, something beyond human understanding occurred. I felt what can only be described as a bolt of supernatural cold shoot up through my right leg like lightning made of ice. The sensation was so intense and so sudden that my entire body jolted in shock. This was not gradual numbness like when your foot falls asleep, or the mild cold you might feel stepping outside on a winter day. This was an immediate, overwhelming freeze that penetrated through my bone marrow and into what felt like my very soul. Within 3 seconds, the cold had spread to encompass both of my legs completely. I could not feel anything below my waist. When I tried to complete the stomping motion, my legs simply would not respond to any signal my brain was sending. It was as if someone had severed every nerve connection between my mind and my lower body, but instead of numbness, there was this piercing, supernatural cold that seemed to radiate outward from the very center of my bones. I had never experienced anything remotely similar in my 28 years of life. My body weight, no longer supported by legs I could not control, sent me crashing down onto the concrete pavement. I landed hard on my side, my hands instinctively reaching down to grab my legs, desperately trying to understand what was happening to me. When I touched my thighs and calves, I could feel them with my hands, but my legs could not feel my hands touching them. It was the most terrifying sensation imaginable. The physical contrast was impossible to comprehend. My hands could feel the warmth of my leg muscles through my jeans, but my legs felt like they had been packed in ice for hours. Panic began to set in immediately. I tried to push myself up using my arms, attempting to force my legs to support my weight, but they were completely unresponsive. It was like trying to stand on 2 blocks of frozen meat. Every attempt to move them resulted in the same complete absence of control. I could see my legs, I could touch them with my hands, but they might as well have belonged to someone else entirely. The cold sensation was so intense that I could almost see frost forming in my mind, even though the August morning was warm and sunny. My followers rushed toward me in complete confusion. They had been expecting to celebrate and film a triumphant moment of Islamic victory, but instead they found me collapsed on the ground, frantically slapping at my own legs and crying out in terror. Several of them knelt beside me, asking what had happened, whether I had slipped or fallen. I tried to explain about the cold and the complete loss of feeling, but my words came out as desperate, panicked gasps. How could I make them understand that something impossible had just occurred? The Christians who had been watching our protest began approaching as well, but their expressions had completely changed. The fear and anger I had seen in their faces moments before had been replaced by genuine concern and confusion. An elderly man in a navy blue suit knelt down beside me and asked if I needed medical attention. A woman with gray hair pulled out her phone and began dialing what I assumed was emergency services. These were the same people I had been tormenting and humiliating for the past 30 minutes, yet they were immediately treating me like a human being in need of help. I kept trying to move my legs, concentrating all of my mental energy on sending signals to my feet, my ankles, my knees. Nothing responded. The cold sensation was not diminishing at all. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying. I could almost feel ice crystals forming inside my leg muscles, spreading through my blood vessels like frozen poison. This was not a medical condition I could explain or understand. This was something that defied every natural law I had ever learned. What terrified me most was the selective nature of what was happening. My arms worked perfectly, my torso felt completely normal, my mind was clear and alert. Only my legs had been affected, and they had been affected in a way that seemed designed specifically to prevent me from completing the action I had been attempting. The symbolism was impossible to ignore, even in my state of panic. I had been trying to use my feet to destroy what Christians believed was God's word, and now my feet would not obey me at all. One of my followers, a young man named Hassan, who had traveled from Manchester for this protest, kept asking if I wanted him to call an ambulance. I could see genuine fear in his eyes as he watched me struggle helplessly on the ground. The other protesters had formed a protective circle around me, unsure whether this was some kind of attack from the Christians or a medical emergency they needed to respond to. Their confusion was evident because nothing about this situation fit any scenario we had prepared for. The Christians continued to gather around us, and their behavior was becoming increasingly difficult for me to process given my current state of mind. According to everything I had believed about their faith and character, they should have been celebrating my obvious distress. They should have seen this as divine justice for my attack on their scripture. Instead, they were offering to help, asking what they could do to assist me, treating me with kindness that I absolutely did not deserve, given what I had just attempted to do to something they held sacred. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached and asked if she could examine my legs to see if there was any obvious injury. When I nodded desperately, she gently pressed her hands against my thighs and calves, checking for swelling or obvious trauma. Her touch was warm and gentle, a sharp contrast to the supernatural cold I was experiencing internally. She looked up at me with genuine concern and said that she could not feel anything wrong with my legs externally, but that we should definitely get medical attention immediately. The strangest part of this entire experience was my growing realization that this cold was not random or accidental. It had begun the exact moment my foot had touched that Bible. It had targeted precisely the part of my body I had been using to commit what Christians would consider a sacrilegious act. The timing and specificity were too perfect to be coincidental. Something or someone had intervened to stop me from completing my planned desecration, and that intervention was unlike anything I had ever heard described in medical literature or Islamic teachings about divine intervention. So I'm asking you, just as someone who experienced the impossible, how do you explain something that defies every natural law while simultaneously protecting the very thing you were trying to destroy? As I lay there on that concrete, surrounded by people I had been attacking who were now trying to help me, I began to suspect that everything I thought I knew about God was about to be challenged in ways I could never have imagined. As I lay there on the cold concrete, helpless and terrified, an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes separated herself from the crowd of concerned church members. She was probably in her 70s, wearing a simple floral dress and carrying a worn leather purse that looked like it had been with her for decades. There was something about her presence that immediately commanded respect, not through authority or force, but through a quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her very being. She approached me slowly, as if she understood that sudden movements might frighten me further in my vulnerable state. She knelt down beside me with some difficulty, her aged joints clearly protesting the movement, but her face showed no sign of discomfort or reluctance. When she spoke, her voice was soft and measured, with a slight Yorkshire accent that made her words sound like a gentle melody. She said, "Young man, my name is Mrs. Thompson, and I've been attending this church for 43 years. I can see that something extraordinary has happened to you, and I believe I know what it is." Her words sent a chill through my entire body that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold still gripping my legs. She continued speaking while maintaining direct eye contact with me, her gaze both compassionate and unnervingly perceptive. I've seen the hand of God move in miraculous ways many times in my life, but what's happened to you today is something very special. You came here to destroy what we believe is God's holy word, and God has chosen to show you His power instead of His wrath. That's not coincidence, dear. That's divine intervention. Her words hit me like physical blows because they articulated exactly what I had been trying to avoid thinking about for the past several minutes. Mrs. Thompson then did something that completely shattered my understanding of how religious conflict was supposed to work. She asked, with genuine sincerity in her voice, "Would you allow me to pray for you? Not to convert you or to prove anything to you, but simply because I believe Jesus wants to heal what's wrong with your legs." Her offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything I had believed about Christian motivations, that I could not immediately process how to respond. According to my understanding of Christianity, she should have been gloating over my obvious punishment, not offering to help me. My first instinct was to refuse her offer completely. Everything I had been taught about Christianity warned against allowing Christians to pray over Muslims, as if their prayers might somehow contaminate or weaken my Islamic faith. But as I lay there, completely helpless and experiencing something that no imam or Islamic scholar had ever prepared me to understand, I realized that my normal rules and guidelines were utterly inadequate for this situation. The supernatural cold in my legs was not responding to any of my own prayers to Allah, and I was desperate for any solution that might restore my ability to walk. I nodded my acceptance of her offer, though I made sure to tell her that I was only agreeing because of my desperate circumstances, not because I believed in the power of Christian prayer. Mrs. Thompson smiled gently and said she understood my position completely. She placed one weathered hand on my shoulder and closed her eyes. The warmth of her touch was startling. It seemed to penetrate through my jacket and shirt to reach skin that had been cold with fear and confusion. That simple human contact was the first comforting sensation I had experienced since my legs had frozen. When Mrs. Thompson began to pray, her words were unlike anything I had expected. She did not pray loudly or dramatically like the street preachers I had encountered during my protests. She did not use complicated theological language or attempt to prove doctrinal points through her prayer. Instead, she spoke to Jesus as if He was standing right beside us, as if He were a close friend who had been waiting for her to ask for help. Her prayer was conversational, intimate, and filled with a confidence that was both humble and absolutely certain. She said, "Jesus, you know this young man's heart better than any of us do. You know why he came here today, and you know why you chose to stop him in such a dramatic way. I'm asking you now to show him your mercy and your love. Please heal his legs so that he can walk again, but more importantly, please open his heart to understand what you're trying to tell him through this experience." As she spoke these words, something began happening inside my chest that was completely separate from the cold in my legs. A warmth started spreading through my rib cage, beginning somewhere near my heart and radiating outward toward my shoulders and stomach. This was not the normal warmth you might feel from physical exertion or emotional excitement. This was something supernatural, something that felt like liquid sunlight flowing through my circulatory system. The contrast between this warmth in my upper body and the persistent cold in my legs created the most unusual sensation I have ever experienced. It was as if two different supernatural forces were operating in my body simultaneously. Mrs. Thompson continued praying, asking Jesus to help me understand that this experience was not punishment, but invitation, not condemnation, but calling. As she spoke, the warmth in my chest intensified, and with it came emotions that I had never associated with anything related to Christianity. I felt peace, genuine peace, for the first time in years. The constant anger and hatred that had driven my activism seemed to be melting away, like snow under warm sunlight. I was still aware of my frozen legs, still frightened by my helpless condition, but the panic was being replaced by something I could only describe as hope. The most shocking part of this experience was the growing realization that everything I was feeling seemed to be coming from the same source that had frozen my legs in the first place. The supernatural cold that had stopped my attack on the Bible and the supernatural warmth that was now flooding my heart were clearly connected, two aspects of the same divine intervention. This was not Allah responding to my situation. This felt like someone entirely different, someone whose presence I had never encountered in all my years of Islamic worship and study. Mrs. Thompson finished her prayer by asking Jesus to give me wisdom to understand what he wanted me to learn from this experience. When she opened her eyes and looked at me, I saw something in her face that broke through every defensive barrier I had built around my heart. It was pure love, unconditional love, offered to someone who had just spent 30 minutes attacking everything she held sacred. That look of love, combined with the warmth still flowing through my chest, created the first crack in the foundation of everything I had believed about God, about Christians, and about the nature of divine truth itself. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself, when was the last time someone showed you genuine love when you least deserved it? That was exactly what Mrs. Thompson was doing, and through her, I was beginning to understand that perhaps the God I was encountering in this church courtyard was not the God I had been taught to hate and fear. Perhaps this God was something entirely different from what I had been prepared to recognize or understand. The warmth that Mrs. Thompson's prayer had ignited in my chest continued to grow stronger, creating an internal battle between the supernatural cold still gripping my legs and this new sensation of divine love flowing through my heart. As I lay there on the concrete, surrounded by the very people I had come to torment, I found myself facing a truth that shattered every foundation of my worldview. The God I had been fighting against was not the cruel, deceptive deity I had been taught to oppose. This was a God of power who chose mercy, a God who could have destroyed me for my blasphemy, but instead was offering me something I had never experienced before, unconditional forgiveness. The internal struggle was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Everything I had been taught about Islam told me that what I was feeling was deception, that Satan was using my desperate circumstances to lead me away from the true path. But the peace flooding through my body felt too pure, too holy, too genuinely divine to be anything evil or false. This was not the chaotic confusion that Islamic teachings warned would accompany demonic influence. This was clarity, love, and truth so powerful that my very soul seemed to be awakening to recognize its source. Mrs. Thompson remained beside me, her hand still resting gently on my shoulder, her eyes closed in continued prayer. I could see tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she interceded for someone who had just attempted to desecrate her most sacred book. Her genuine emotion broke through the last of my intellectual resistance. No one could fake the kind of love I was witnessing. No religious system based on lies could produce this level of authentic compassion for enemies. Everything I had believed about Christian motivations and character was crumbling before the reality of what I was experiencing firsthand. The moment of complete surrender came suddenly and without warning. Looking up at the clear blue sky above the church courtyard, I found myself crying out words I had never planned to speak, words that seemed to flow from somewhere deeper than my conscious mind. I said, Jesus, if you are real, if you are truly God, please forgive me for everything I have done. The words felt strange and foreign in my mouth, but also surprisingly natural, as if I had been preparing to say them my entire life without knowing it. What happened next defied every law of medicine and physics that I had ever learned. The moment I spoke Jesus' name with genuine faith instead of hatred, I felt something shift dramatically inside my legs. The supernatural cold that had paralyzed me for nearly 20 minutes began to retreat, not gradually like normal warming, but in distinct waves that moved from my hips downward toward my feet. It was as if invisible hands were literally peeling layers of ice away from my bones and muscles, restoring feeling and function with each passing second. The sensation was indescribable. Imagine the relief of feeling returning to a limb that has been completely numb, then multiply that by 1,000 and add the overwhelming realization that you are witnessing a miracle performed specifically for you. As warmth and sensation flooded back into my legs, I could actually feel the presence of Jesus Christ as clearly as I could feel the concrete beneath my body. This was not imagination or wishful thinking. This was an encounter with divine power that was transforming my physical body in real time. Mrs. Thompson opened her eyes and looked down at me with an expression of joyful amazement. She had felt the change too, somehow sensing that her prayer was being answered even before I demonstrated my healing. She whispered, "He's done it, hasn't he? Jesus has healed you." Her words were not a question, but a statement of absolute certainty. She had seen enough miracles in her lifetime to recognize one when it occurred right in front of her. I slowly pushed myself up into a sitting position, then carefully moved my legs to test their restored function. The feeling was completely normal, as if the paralysis had never occurred at all. But more than that, my legs felt stronger and more alive than they had in years. I could sense every muscle fiber, every nerve ending, every drop of blood flowing through my restored limbs. This was not just healing. This was recreation, as if Jesus had given me entirely new legs to replace the ones he had temporarily taken away. Standing up required enormous courage, because part of me was terrified that the paralysis might return the moment I put weight on my legs. But Mrs. Thompson encouraged me gently, extending her hand to help me rise. When I finally stood fully upright, the crowd of church members who had gathered around us erupted in spontaneous applause and praise. Some were crying, others were laughing with joy, and several were already on their phones calling friends and family to share news of the miracle they had just witnessed. The physical healing was complete and undeniable, but it was nothing compared to the spiritual transformation occurring simultaneously in my heart. As I stood there, surrounded by Christians who were celebrating my recovery, I realized that I could no longer hate these people or their faith. The Jesus who had just healed my body was the same Jesus they worshipped every Sunday in this very church. The love they had shown me during my most vulnerable moment was a direct reflection of their God's character. Everything I had believed about Christianity had been wrong, catastrophically and completely wrong. My followers stood in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. Several of them approached me cautiously, asking if I was truly healed, whether this was some kind of trick or medical coincidence. I could see in their eyes the same cognitive dissonance I was experiencing. If Allah was the only true God, how could Jesus Christ perform such an obvious miracle? If Christianity was false, how could Christian prayer restore my ability to walk? These questions hung in the air between us, unanswered and unanswerable within the framework of our Islamic worldview. I looked around at the Christians surrounding me, then at the Bible still lying open on the ground where I had dropped it when my legs froze. Walking over to that book on legs that Jesus had just healed, I knelt down and picked it up with trembling hands. The weight of the book felt completely different now. Instead of the burden of blasphemy I had felt earlier, I now held what I was beginning to understand was truly the word of the God who had just saved me from my own hatred and ignorance. Ask yourself this question. When God demonstrates His power in your life in such an undeniable way, how can you continue living as if He doesn't exist? That was exactly the question I faced as I stood in that church courtyard, holding a Bible in hands that belonged to legs Jesus Christ had just healed. There was no going back to my old life, no pretending this experience had never happened. I had encountered the living God, and that encounter had changed everything about who I was and what I believed about ultimate reality. The walk home from St. Mary's Church that afternoon was the longest journey of my life, not because of physical distance, but because every step I took on my miraculously healed legs carried me further away from the person I had been and closer to someone I did not yet know how to become. I carried the Bible that I had tried to destroy, holding it carefully against my chest like the precious treasure I was beginning to understand it truly was. My followers walked beside me in confused silence, occasionally asking questions I could not yet answer because I was still trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred. When I arrived at my family's home in Birmingham that evening, I knew I was about to face the most difficult conversation of my life. My parents were waiting in the living room, having heard about the failed protest through the network of concerned friends and family members who monitor the activities of young Muslim activists. They expected me to return angry and frustrated about some kind of police interference or Christian resistance. They were not prepared for what I actually had to tell them. I sat down across from my father and mother, placed the Bible on the coffee table between us, and began to explain what had happened at the church. I told them about the supernatural freezing of my legs, about Mrs. Thompson's prayer, about the miraculous healing that had restored my ability to walk. I described the overwhelming sense of love and peace that had flooded through my heart when I called on the name of Jesus. With each detail I shared, I watched their faces transform from confusion to concern to horror. My father, the imam who had raised me to be a defender of Islamic truth, stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. He declared that I had been deceived by Satan himself, that my desperation had made me vulnerable to demonic influence designed to lead me away from the straight path of Islam. He pointed to the Bible on our table as evidence of my corruption, demanding that I remove it from his house immediately. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. His son, his pride and joy, was describing an experience that threatened everything he had built his life and ministry upon. My mother's reaction was even more devastating. She began crying uncontrollably, asking where she had failed as a parent, wondering how her child could be so easily deceived by what she believed were obvious lies. She begged me to speak with our imam, to seek counseling from Islamic scholars who could help me understand that my experience had been nothing more than psychological manipulation combined with medical coincidence. Her genuine anguish broke my heart because I knew that my transformation would cause her pain that might never fully heal. The conversation continued for hours, with my parents alternating between anger, grief, and desperate attempts to reason with me. They brought out Islamic texts that warned against exactly the kind of experience I was describing. They reminded me of my years of education about Christian deception and the importance of remaining steadfast in the face of enemy tactics. Every argument they made had been convincing to me just days earlier, but now their words sounded hollow against the memory of supernatural power flowing through my body as Jesus healed my legs. The final break came when my father issued an ultimatum that I had been dreading but expecting. He told me that I could either renounce this Christian delusion and return to faithful Islamic practice, or I could leave his house and never consider myself his son again. The choice was absolute and immediate. There would be no gradual transition, no time to explore my new beliefs while maintaining family relationships. I had to choose between the God who had just revealed himself to me and the family who had raised and loved me for 28 years. I picked up the Bible from the coffee table, held it close to my heart, and told my parents that I could not deny what Jesus had done for me that day. The sound of my mother's sobs as I walked toward the door will haunt me for the rest of my life. These were people who loved me deeply, but their understanding of divine truth could not accommodate what I had experienced. My conversion to Christianity meant losing the most important human relationships I had ever known, but denying Jesus would mean losing the most important divine relationship I had ever discovered. I spent the next 6 weeks living in a small flat that Mrs. Thompson helped me secure near St. Mary's Church. During this period, I immersed myself completely in studying the Bible and learning about Christian doctrine from Pastor Williams and other church members, who welcomed me with open arms despite knowing exactly who I had been and what I had tried to do to their faith community. Every page of scripture I read seemed to speak directly to my situation, explaining the very experiences I was living through and the transformation occurring in my heart. The decision to be baptized came naturally after weeks of study and prayer. On October 15th, 2023, I stood in the baptismal pool at St. Mary's Church before a congregation that included many of the same people who had witnessed my miraculous healing months earlier. As Pastor Williams lowered me under the water in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I felt the last remnants of my old identity washing away. When I emerged from that water, I was no longer Arif, the Muslim activist who had dedicated his life to fighting Christianity. I was Arif the Christian, reborn through the mercy of Jesus Christ. My new life began immediately. Within weeks, I was volunteering with the church's outreach ministry, sharing my testimony with other Muslims who were seeking truth or struggling with questions about their faith. God took my greatest shame and transformed it into my most powerful ministry tool. The very hatred that had once driven me to attack Christianity now gave me unique credibility when speaking to others who harbored similar animosity toward the gospel. Today, too, years after that miraculous morning in the church courtyard, I work full-time as a Christian evangelist, focused specifically on Muslim outreach. I travel throughout the United Kingdom, sharing my testimony at churches, universities, and interfaith dialogue events. Every time I tell my story, I watch faces in the audience transform as people realize that the same Jesus who healed my legs and forgave my blasphemy is available to transform their lives as well. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself what barriers you have constructed between yourself and God's love. Perhaps you have not attacked Christianity as aggressively as I did, but we all have areas of resistance where we refuse to let Jesus be Lord of our lives. My story is not ultimately about the dramatic miracle of my physical healing, though that certainly got my attention. My story is about a God who loves his enemies so much that he will perform miracles to save them from their own hatred and ignorance. If my testimony has touched your heart in any way, I want you to know that the same Jesus who transformed my life is calling to you right now. You do not need to wait for your legs to freeze or for supernatural intervention to get your attention. His love is available to you this very moment, regardless of your background, your past mistakes, or your current doubts about Christianity. The God who turned his greatest enemy into his devoted servant is ready to do the same miracle of transformation in your life today. Do not let pride, family expectations, or religious tradition keep you from the relationship that your soul was created to enjoy. Jesus Christ is real, his love is unconditional, and his power to change lives is unlimited. If he could forgive and heal someone like me after what I tried to do to his word, there is absolutely nothing in your life that is beyond his ability to redeem and transform for his glory and your eternal joy.